Welcome to the Emotional Balance Sheet, the go-to podcast for parents with multiple kids, especially those with twins, triplets, or more, who are navigating the maze of modern family life and personal finance. Whether you're overwhelmed by education or retirement planning, parenting dilemmas, career transitions, or trying to define your purpose and plan, we're here to guide you with empathy, encouragement, and expertise. Hosted by Paul Fenner, founder of Tama Capital, a certified financial planner and parent to 4 kids, including a set of triplets. Our podcast is your ally in the quest for financial peace of mind, proving that money matters, but family comes first. Subscribe now and join our community of empowered parents at tamacapital.com. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for investment decisions. Clients of Tama may retain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
What does comprehensive financial planning even mean? At Tama Capital, it means a family office where lifestyle planning such as retirement, college, portfolio management, and tax prep and planning are all under one umbrella. But it goes beyond numbers. We focus as much on the emotional side of financial planning as we do on the financial side. We get you. We understand your challenges of building a family, business or career, and a healthy life. We are devoted to wealth planning for families like yours because we are you. Learn how our family can help your family by visiting tamacapital.com. What if you could prevent cognitive decline, such as dementia or Alzheimer's? Would you do it, even if it meant you had to make significant life changes? Dr. Teryn Clarke, a resident neurologist expert, is back to discuss the significance of cognitive exercise for maintaining brain health and preventing decline, such as Alzheimer's. Our conversation explores various exercises, the most important, lifelong learning, which is surprising, and the role of motivation in making lifestyle changes. Dr. Clarke emphasizes that while cognitive exercises can help preserve brain function, reversing cognitive decline is challenging once symptoms appear. This conversation highlights the need for early intervention and adoption of healthy habits to promote brain health. We discuss gamified cognitive programs like Wordle, manual brain exercises, and the critical concept of cognitive reserve, which are all actionable strategies for better brain health. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Teryn Clarke. Okay, Dr. Teryn Clarke, welcome back to the Emotional Balance Sheet podcast. For the listeners, they probably don't know this. We're actually trying a new recording platform today, and we have our fingers crossed that this is going to work. So, well, Teryn, welcome back. Always a pleasure to have you, and getting great feedback on these monthly conversations of ours.
It's great to be back. And I think we had decided that we would talk about cognitive exercise, brain exercise, and why that's healthy. And trying something new like this new tech platform is right in line with that, right? All the problem solving, being flexible. So it's perfect that that's the topic for today.
Well, I had actually been thinking about this, and then I was reading the chapter in your book, Brain Health, about this. And I don't know how my kids got into this, but they started doing the New York Times Wordle, and they got me hooked on the darn thing. And so it's like one of those gamification things, like where you have a streak going and you don't want to end your streak. So it's one of those things where every night before I go to bed, if I forget to do it during the day, I always make sure that I'm doing it. And so it just got me thinking. And then ironically, I was reading that chapter in your book. I'm like, well, this is a topic of conversation that I want to go down because your specialty, and again, I think one of the reasons why I was so happy that you agreed to do these conversations with me is that brain health is so important. I mean, we talk about physical health, mental health. Obviously, the brain works, into that. But I actually did get a question from a listener, like, well, why do you have like Dr. Teryn on, and why do you have Dr. Jen Dragonette on to talk about the psychology of therapy and things like that? I'm like, because if we don't get a grip on our health issues, it doesn't matter how much we save or what we plan to do from a financial planning perspective. It's all downhill from there. And so this is like me trying to get the word out that this is important, and what can we do now? I think because a lot of people that listen, I don't have exact demographics, but there are a lot of parents I know that listen, so they're probably between the ages of 35 and 55, and there's things that we can still do now to prevent things like Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. And so that's why I just love these conversations. So when it comes to these cognitive exercises, walk us through like what these are and then how they can benefit us.
So I love our conversations too, because I love your holistic approach to your clients and listeners. I mean, financial planning for the future is one part of it, but I just see that you want them to thrive as whole people, to be not only financially healthy, but also physically healthy, mentally healthy. So I love the opportunity, partly because I see people who are interested in their finances going forward as planners, as people really thinking about the future. And so those people are by definition going to be more likely to take hold of that message about how to keep themselves healthier and run with it, because they're thinking about the future. They're not just putting their head in the sand like an ostrich, and about things like Alzheimer's disease. And as you said, there's so much we can do about it. It's why I wrote the book, Brain Health Action Plan, to guide people through what habits they can adopt. And cognitive exercise is an entire chapter of that book. So the reason we know that cognitive exercise is important for brain health is not just because we've seen people who retire early and don't challenge themselves and they deteriorate quickly. Probably most of us have seen that, but the science actually backs that up really well. And when scientists looked at the lifestyle risk factors that contribute to dementia, a big one of those was lack of education. And so that can feel kind of defeatist, because a lot of people just think, well, education, that's done. I'm 35. I went as far as in school as I did. Or they think I'm 35 and I have a PhD, so I don't have that risk factor. And both of those are not the correct attitude. Really, when we look at cognitive exercise or education as a risk factor, it's just a surrogate for thinking really hard. So when you think really hard, problem solving, getting deep into tasks, there are two things that happen. You increase blood flow to the brain, which is super healthy for the brain. You bring in extra oxygen, you take out toxins with that extra blood flow. And then the other thing is that that's how our nerves make new connections with each other. And that's really what's increasing in brain volume when we're maturing as kids and teenagers. Is we're not necessarily building as many new neurons, but we're building new connections with those neurons. And so whether we look at kids or whether we look at people who lived into their 90s, which is a local study that was done here, what we see is having as many of those synaptic connections, those little tree branches that go from one neuron to connect to another one to communicate, that protects us from the effects of some of the damage that builds up as we age. So we can do that earlier in life, but we can make up for it later. And even if we did that earlier in life, we need to keep stimulating our brains to keep those connections robust.
That's really interesting, because I didn't really realize that. Is that one reason why it's easier for, and I don't know if there's a connection here, but is that why it's easier for kids to learn new things versus adults? And when I say adults, like even people in their late 20s or early 30s.
That's one of the major reasons, because the kiddos are just building out those synaptic connections like crazy. We didn't used to appreciate that there was any new neuron growth in the brain in the past, but scientists did discover there is some, and importantly, it's in this short-term memory structure. They've measured it. So that's one of the reasons it's critical. There is some new connection going on throughout life. And if we're not learning, then we're growing little shrubs and tree branches to connect to each other, but they're not making a connection because there's no new learning. And so one of the things you brought up Wordle, which I also like, although I was sitting next to a lady on the plane once and she was like shielding her eyes because I was doing Wordle. So I haven't done it yet. I haven't done it yet. And after I finished, so I kind of turned my phone. And after I finished, she said, have you done Quordle? Which is like 4 at once and super fun. So now I'm more addicted to Quordle. But one of the things I would bring up to your listeners, if they're working and problem solving, doing cognitively demanding work, that's pretty organic, well-rounded cognitive exercise. So they may not need to build in specific times of their day that they're doing cognitive exercise. Where it comes in is if our work is just kind of on autopilot and we're not challenging our brain, then we may need to think about specifically exercising our brain in other ways. Or for people who are retired, it's really important to build in a regimen, almost like thinking about it like a multivitamin, hitting the brain from every different way that we think. So Wordle can be part of that. Sudoku could be a different part. All of these tasks exercise different parts of the brain. So that's where things like Lumosity come up, Brain HQ. Those are online courses where they'll run you through exercising every different part of your brain in a pretty quick fashion, and they make it trackable. And so you get a streak, which also helps reinforce doing it every day. And those will hit every area. Because usually people who like crosswords do crosswords and they love that. And that part of their brain is very healthy and gets regular exercise. But maybe they don't like math, or maybe they don't like playing solitaire. And the way I think of that is if you just go to the gym, and this is in the book, so if people read the book, it's going to be duplication, but it's a good example. If you go to the gym and all you do are bicep curls, because that's really what you like, your biceps are going to be awesome and very strong, but the rest of your body is going to be weak. And so when you're doing just one kind of cognitive exercise, that's what happens. You keep that part strong, but we've got to attend to all of those other parts of the brain to keep them healthy. We've got, spatial, math, language, short-term memory, immediate memory. There are all kinds of different parts of the brain that need to be exercising and nourishing those connections between cells.
That's really interesting because I never, and even reading that part of the book, like it's just now hitting me like I think your example of going to the gym and just doing the bicep curls is great because I think most people think, well, I'm already doing something. I'm doing my Wordle or crossword puzzle, but yet there's really so much more that you could be doing, and based on what you're telling us, we should be doing. We should be doing multiple different ways to exercise the various parts of our cognitive abilities.
Correct. And so the other thing with those programs that are pretty well-rounded is I don't mean to promote either one, and I don't have an interest in either one, but they also have gamified the process of doing cognitive exercise. Yeah. You can design that yourself. You can do Wordle and Quordle and I forget the other one where you're trying to find the matches for 4 different categories. There are all kinds of games you could do. It just takes longer to design your own program, and it takes longer to run through it. So that's the benefit of some of those online programs is it runs you through it in a pretty brief amount of time and tracks your progress. So those are great. Some people who like to do pen and paper kinds of things, and there's workbooks for adult cognitive exercise. It's kind of a big area, actually, because it's so important. It really is an area where if you don't use it, you lose it. And when you're not exercising certain parts of your brain, those parts do become rusty. Math. We've got our phones, we're calculating the tip, or now the tip comes calculated on the receipt.
Right, on the receipt.
Yeah, it's so easy. We rarely do mental math. And so it's a great idea to once in a while take the time to do the mental math or take the time to do the paper math. It's just these phones are great, but there's a lot of things we're letting them take over and we're not exercising our brain.
So when you have patients come in to see you, and you can, when you're evaluating them and you can see maybe some potential cracks in their cognitive ability, like they could potentially be going on a downward trend, are there specific things that you recommend to them to be able to course correct? And I guess that's really the question I'm asking is when you see somebody in cognitive decline, can doing things like this, like these cognitive exercises, help rebound, build those synapses or connections to help heal? Or is it too late?
Yeah, when somebody's already in cognitive decline and for example, they already have developed the early signs of Alzheimer's disease, at that point, what we're trying to do is just preserve what they've had. The new neuron growth we have is not robust enough to reverse. So I do address all their lifestyle factors, everything that's in the book, low sugar, physical exercise, managing stress. I try to get every single risk factor minimized to slow progression.
Seed oils,
that
seed oil conversation. I've had probably 4 or 5 people talk to me about that or ask me, I had no idea about that. I'm like, no, neither did I. And this is exactly why I love having you on to talk about this, because it's just something I never knew what it is and came up, but it does.
Yeah, I had no idea until probably about 3 or 4 years ago. So, but then when you start looking, they're everywhere, and you see societies that have high seed oil consumption, and generally their health kind of goes along with the amount of seed oils a society or a country consumes. But so it's really why I'm so passionate about prevention. We've got to start these habits earlier in life. And when you bring up seed oils, that's really a great example. So seed oils, get stored in our fat cells. So to get rid of those, it's not an overnight process. It takes probably a year or two to really get those cleared out of our body, the ones that we have stored in our fat cells. So it's why it's much better to not put them in the first place, or not add to it when we're trying to get them out of our cells. But it's really hard to reverse Alzheimer's disease once it's started up, because the process has been going on by the time we see symptoms for probably 20 or 30 years. So we generally don't have that much time to try to work it backwards once it's here. And, so for those 2 reasons that it goes on, the process happens way before we see any symptoms from it. And because it's so hard to see any reversal, it's why we've got to adopt these habits earlier in life to try to prevent it from happening in the first place.
That's interesting, because when you think of the brain, when somebody unfortunately has a heart attack, it's not that heart attack just happened immediately. Obviously it did, but what was the build up to that? And so the heart is a muscle, and from my limited medical knowledge, that you can strengthen that, right? You can just going to the gym and exercising. But when it comes to the brain, what I hear you're saying, Dr. Teryn, is that it's not, you can't reverse cardiovascular disease like you can. You can do that, but when it comes to something like Alzheimer's and brain health, you can't. Once you have it, there's basically no going back. And I think you used the word, you're just trying to help your patients maintain where they're currently at. Am I off base on that?
Yes. So you're accurate, because by the time we see symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, in terms of memory starting to be a challenge, that's because we've already lost so many neurons in our brain. We've had so much cell death. So generally, they're not just dysfunctional neurons that we can support and then they'll function well. Generally, at that point, a lot of the neurons are dead, and that's not a reversible process. So another reason we know that cognitive exercise is really important is because it builds something called cognitive reserve. And I think one of the most fascinating studies that we have that illustrates this is actually happened in my neck of the woods, happened in Orange County, California, in a really, really large retirement community that opened up in the 1970s. And there was a big study, a group of researchers were just collecting massive amounts of data on the residents there. And they did that through the 70s and 80s. And then the research project just kind of petered out. And another researcher at that university, about 10 years ago or so now, came across the data, all these files that had been abandoned. And so what she did is she went back to that community and looked for people who were still alive, who had had all that data collected in the 70s and 80s. And so all of those people were in their 90s when she came across them, the ones that were still alive. And so she was able to start following those people again. And all of those people had agreed to have an autopsy when they passed away. And one of the interesting things they found were that even in the healthy people that lived into their 90s, when they passed away, even if they didn't have Alzheimer's disease or another dementia, when they looked at their brains, they found all the characteristics of Alzheimer's disease, those abnormal proteins. They also found lots of tiny strokes in all of their brains. And so their question really was, how did these people, how are they not suffering from the clinical signs of Alzheimer's disease? These were people that were driving, thriving, living on their own. And when they looked at it, what they found is they had high cognitive reserve. They had so much brain volume and so many cells and connections that they were able to form alternate pathways to get things done. So if you've got a lot of cognitive reserve, meaning you've got extra brain tissue, if you've got damage in one pathway, you have enough cells to develop another pathway to get around that area of damage and still function at your best. So that's another reason that education, in terms of early life education or cognitive exercise as we move through life, is really important. So you have that mental flexibility to use alternate pathways if one of them has a small stroke in it or has some of the Alzheimer's protein buildup and cell death. So that is one of the studies that I find just so impressive in helping us understand why early education and lifelong learning are important.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I want to come back to an emotional question. Is when you're meeting with a patient for the first time and explaining that they have like early onset dementia or Alzheimer's, like what's that take us into like what that conversation is like, is because my mind naturally goes, if I'm still like relatively young, like 65 or even 70, and you're telling me this, I'd be like, okay, doc, just tell me how to fix it. Right. But like throughout this conversation, what I'm picking up is like, there's really nothing you can do to quote unquote fix it. You just have, there may be some things that we can maintain what you currently have, but that ship has kind of sailed. Like I would imagine that's a very difficult conversation to have.
Yes, it is. So once I've met with a patient and I've gone through laboratories and MRIs and things to be sure there's nothing reversible, because actually a lot of times when people come to me with a memory change, many times we find something that's an underlying cause that's treatable or reversible. So if we get to the point that it looks like from all the data we have that probably they're suffering from Alzheimer's disease or another dementia like a cerebrovascular disease, which is small strokes building up, then the approach is really to do everything in their lifestyle that we can to slow the process down, all the interventions that are in the book. Because on top of that foundation, there are some medications that will further slow things down. But those medications, the effect is quite mild. And so if we just use that medication or those medications in combination, but we don't build that foundation of proper lifestyle, those medications aren't going to be able to outpace the ongoing damage that's happening from, eating too much sugar and which triggers inflammation and oxidation and just keeps this cell death going on in the brain. So we've got to try to address all the processes that are killing the neurons and stop that. And then on top of that, we can add some medications to really slow things down. And it's not as hopeless as people who haven't met with a neurologist might think. I mean, if we use these combination of medications on top of a foundation of proper lifestyle for brain health, we can slow things down by 50 to 100%. So what that means is if somebody comes to me with really early signs of dementia or Alzheimer's disease,
And what age could that be at,
pardon?
Teryn? What age could that be at?
I mean, it can be any age. So people can come in their 60s or 70s. What I'm mostly talking about is late onset dementia, which is 65 and over. And then I would make the distinction of early signs of Alzheimer's disease versus early onset. Early onset are those familial cases that are under 65. They're generally in their 40s or 50s. People usually know that gene runs in their family because every generation has it. It doesn't skip. But for the more typical folks, because most of what we see are Alzheimer's cases that start after 65, in that case, if I see somebody that's just having memory issues, short-term memory issues, but they're not having trouble doing their day-to-day activities, that phase or stage usually lasts about 7 years before they convert to dementia, which is where they might have trouble doing their day-to-day tasks or paying monthly bills. So if we can get their lifestyle optimized and incorporate medications and stretch out that stage by 50 to 100%, now that stage is lasting 10 to 14 years. That's a lot of good health. We actually can function pretty well, even with challenges to our memory, as long as we're able to do our day-to-day tasks, live independently, pay our bills, write checks, and things like that. So that's my goal, is to get people in the office as early as I can, because the earlier stages are longer. And so we're going to get a bigger benefit from stretching those out. And my goal is to not have them get to the late stages of dementia during their lifetime, because those are really the ugly things we're trying to avoid.
Yeah. So what have you seen as far as taking action in educating people about this? Have you found anything that works, that really strikes a chord with people, that they are willing to listen and come up with a strategy with objectives and action items to right the ship, if you will?
I've seen, so there's variability in motivation, which kind of surprises me, because I imagine if I were in that boat, I would do everything. Like, no matter what you told me to do, like stand on my head for 2 hours a day, I would probably do that, right? Like, I'm really motivated. And for me, it's right here. My mom had dementia, and so did both of her parents. So I have a really strong family history. Having said that, it's a big variable of how much motivation people have. And that's because the motivation center in the brain can be affected by Alzheimer's disease. So some people have had that relatively spared. And when they're in my office, that hasn't been affected yet. And they're able to be really motivated to make changes. And those people do tremendously well. I've had quite a few people that I don't know if it's their underlying personality or it's their motivation center and their judgment center that's already impaired. I talk about cutting down sugar, and they'll just say, like, I'm not cutting out my Eggos in the morning. I'm not cutting out having a muffin or a cinnamon roll in the morning. And that's what they have a pastry every day, and they're not cutting that out. And they kind of make a joke about it, which is, I can't relate to, because I would easily change my breakfast to avoid that. Or they just say, I'm not going to exercise. I never have, I never will. And so sometimes I can get them to do a little bit of exercise, but that's a challenge when people have an attitude of resistance to healthy lifestyle choices. It's hard for me because I know what's going to happen. I've seen it before, and I know what road we're going to go down, and I know what their deterioration is going to be like. So having those habits built earlier in life, I mean, generally when people come in and they have a lot of really healthy lifestyle habits, it's easier just to tweak a few areas. If they've already got a fairly good foundation, those people sometimes we're trying to fight their genetics, and they were lifelong exercisers, but they didn't know that sugar was so bad, or they didn't realize how much sugar is in the food they're eating. So sometimes we can make little tweaks that make a big difference. An area where I've seen it make a huge difference actually are the people who have Parkinson's related dementia. I don't know exactly why that is, but for those folks, when they make lifestyle changes, especially exercise and cutting down their sugar, I've seen them have the biggest impact on the rate of their deterioration. I actually have one gentleman who completely reversed his memory challenges and got back into the normal range to the point that he really didn't need to come see me for several years. I mean, he eventually... Yeah, it was miraculous. I mean, he and his wife were both sitting in my office crying because you can't fake normal cognitive testing. If we talk about the placebo effect, if I have somebody in a migraine headache trial, there can be some placebo effect there because we do have some mind control over our migraine frequency, over our interpretation of pain. So it's, we can't have a placebo effect there, which is a great thing. We should harness the placebo effect whenever we can to minimize drug use. But, cognitive testing is not really one of those things where generally you can go from having impaired cognitive testing to the normal range. And so when you see those, which, I've seen several times, it's really impressive. That gentleman did eventually come back to me about 4 or 5 years later with, again, just some mild memory problems, but he had clearly staved off his memory problems for years by adopting some lifestyle habits. He in particular was doing really intense memory work. So, memorizing lists of 20 words every morning and shifting them around and getting them in order. He committed himself to that being his number one priority was his brain health. So, it can be done. And I don't know why it's so effective for the Parkinson's patients, that they have a unique ability to change their trajectory of cognitive impairment with lifestyle changes.
Wow, that's really interesting. So my takeaway from this is that there are things that you can do when you catch it early enough, but when you don't catch it early enough, it becomes really too late and there's nothing that you can do. But what I think the interesting thing that you were bringing up there, and I just had this conversation with Professor Ayelet Fishbach of the University of Chicago, who's a behavioral scientist there, and she wrote the book Get It Done. She's like, I call her like the godmother of motivation. So maybe I ought to hook you two up
That'd be great.
To collaborate on something, because she's done so much research around the science of motivation, and that's a really interesting connection between, is there something that happened in the brain that you lose that ability for motivation, or is it something else that's cognitive? That could be an interesting thread for the two of you.
Yes, I mean, part of it is a brain deterioration in that area. So that is hard to get around. It also speaks to, there's a great neurologist named Dale Bredesen, and he wrote a book several years ago called The End of Alzheimer's. And in that, he was able to actually reverse Alzheimer's disease. And so that gave everybody great hope when it first came out. And I actually had a few patients who wanted to participate in that program. I became a Bredesen certified provider. The interventions were so challenging, it completely turned people's lifestyles upside down. And I didn't find anybody, no matter how motivated they were, who could incorporate all the changes. And really, he had at one point talked about, hasn't done it, but he had talked about having like an induction center where you'd basically go to this retreat. They would start all these lifestyle interventions, get you on the path, and then send you home. And it really would have to be something like that. You'd have to be in a controlled environment to have such a restrictive lifestyle and be able to maintain it. So I don't think that's realistic. I had great hope that we would be able to reverse dementias, but I have not seen that be able to be done in clinical practice. It's so impossible to do all of those interventions. I wish it weren't, because clearly it would be wonderful if we could reverse, as he did in his study, but I just haven't seen it be able to be replicated, unfortunately.
So if you haven't already gotten it, get a copy of Dr. Teryn's book, because I think the one key takeaway I think that I'm walking away with today is, like anything, is prevention and doing the right things today to set yourself up for, future success and more importantly, health. So I think that's probably a good point to wrap up this conversation. This has been so interesting. I love these conversations, Teryn, and getting into the details of this. And people, don't forget to exercise your brain and not just the other parts of your body.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I love these conversations too.
Thanks, Teryn. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
I think this was one of my best conversations I've had with Dr. Teryn since we've started these conversations many months ago. And the reason is that not only did we provide, or actually Dr. Clarke provided, actionable steps to help improve your cognitive brain health, but we also got into the emotional component of what she does as a neurologist working with patients who have early onset dementia or Alzheimer's. And if you haven't picked up a copy of her book, I'd really encourage you to grab one. But the one overlay that her work and my work as a financial advisor is that the critical role that prevention plays, and education plays, and continuous learning plays in having a successful plan, whether that's financial or health and strategy, and how getting a hold of the ideas of working towards something, having that objective in mind and a strategy to be able to achieve it are really critical. And again, I often get the question, well, why do you have these medical professions often on the show, Paul? And it's because if we don't have our mental health or our physical health, we could have the best laid out financial plan ever. But if we're not taking care of ourselves, our bodies, our families, our brains, then all of the savings in the world won't matter. And likewise, having your health and not saving financially won't lead to the outcomes you want either. So there's a balance, a harmony actually is the word I want to use, a harmony that people need to find. And I think through having these conversations, I'm hopeful that you can help find that for yourself and your family. If you've enjoyed this conversation, could you do me a favor? Do you know anyone else who would enjoy these types of conversations where we talk about the intersections of our emotional and financial lives? Because if you do, it's actually going to help both of us. Could you share this conversation with someone? They will think you're great because you just gave them this terrific podcast, and it helps me grow my audience. Or you can tell them to go to tamacapital.com. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.